Good morning from Washington, D.C., and welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks, where we aim to bring you the best and most innovative learning there is in peace building and beyond. If this is your first Thursday talk, you've made a good choice to join us today. And if you're a regular guest, welcome back. My name is Lena Slackmulder, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Programs at Search for Common Ground, and I'm going to be moderating this session today. And today our discussion is going to be focusing on a guide to countering violent extremism at the local level. And I'm delighted to welcome Theo Dolan, who's technical advisor at FHI 360, and who is going to be sharing with us their newly launched digital toolkit, a CVE reference guide for local organizations. So many thanks for joining us today, Theo, and leading our discussion. So just before we start, a note about how we're going to spend our 45 minutes together. As Theo presents, you can write your questions or reflections using the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard. And we'll then collect those and bring it into the conversation when we get to the question and answer section. When you do that, it's helpful if you write your name and affiliation. And then after Theo's presentation, he also has some questions for all of us. So there'll be more on that later, but with that, let me hand it over to Theo. So welcome, Theo.
Thanks very much, Lena, and welcome everyone to this brief presentation and discussion on the CVE reference guide for local organizations. As Lena said, my name is Theo Dolan. I'm a technical advisor for FHI 360's Civil Society and Peacebuilding Department. And I'd like to thank Search for Common Ground very much for hosting this webinar. So this CVE reference guide, what is it? It's an online reference guide for local organizations. Whoops. That supports civil society organizations to prevent and counter violent extremism by sharing the most relevant material and practical tools that are geared to the needs of local implementers and related to the 5 stages of the PCVE project cycle that you see here. Sorry for the scrolling issues. Okay, so the guide is designed for local organizations working at the community, subnational, and national level in their countries to prevent and counter violent extremism. It's designed for a range of local organizations, including those who are less experienced, looking for foundational frameworks, to those much more experienced, looking for very specific technical and detailed information. And with that wide-ranging audience in mind, the online reference guide provides users with the ability to easily navigate modules and find materials according to their needs and available time. Here are the basics. The CVE reference guide is funded by USAID under the Strengthening Civil Society Globally Leader Award Learning Agenda, with additional support from USAID's Africa Bureau. As you'll see in the next slide, it is truly responsive to civil society needs and interests. The beta website was vetted by about a dozen civil society partners, and we incorporated their feedback into the final version, which you'll see. The reference guide is designed as a living resource, so we intend to update it and maintain it. And ideally, we'll be incorporating PCVE tools and resources produced by local organizations as well. Pending further funding, it's intended for a translation into Arabic and French to expand the reach and the utility of the guide. And a unique feature of the website is that it's designed and built fully in-house at FHI 360. So this gives us the flexibility to maintain and update it without relying on any external partners. Okay, as I mentioned, the CVE reference guide is truly informed by local organizations. We conducted an online survey and subsequent interviews with dozens of civil society organizations globally, which are implementing PCVE activities. Ultimately, I think we covered 5 continents and more than 30 countries among those who responded to the surveys and interview requests. We also interviewed about a dozen international practitioners to understand more about their research products and to ensure we were avoiding duplicating any effort. So here's a sample on this slide of what we were told by local organizations they would like out of this reference guide. Obviously, they wanted more online information, so we produced an online reference guide. They also indicated that they'd prefer simple handouts when engaging local communities. So we produced easy-to-use worksheets and practical exercises that they could bring to their communities. Many CSOs found that a lot of the PCVE toolkits available and reports were simply too long and cumbersome, and their staff didn't have time to apply the material. So we produced easy to navigate modular content, graphics, worksheets, and links to the most useful resources. Many CSOs also wanted to tailor resources to their own communities. So again, we generated user-friendly frameworks, tools, and worksheets for adapting and applying them to local context. And consensus among many of the CSOs we spoke with is that they preferred most guidance in the design area, as well as monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So we really doubled down on providing the most useful tools and frameworks for PCVE design, M&E, and learning. And I'll be walking through the M&E module just to highlight this need. Okay, so I'd like to walk through one module of the guide. If you'd like to follow along, the site can be found at www.cvereferenceguide.org. Let me just shift over to that. Bear with me for a second. Okay, can everyone see this? All right.
Yeah, it looks good.
Great, thank you. So this is the home page of the CVE Reference Guide for Local Organizations. And the site navigation is basically centered around this top menu bar. There's the Get Started page. The 5 modules are here in the Explore the Guide tab. We have an extensive resource library, which I'll describe, and there are cross-cutting sections, which I'll also get into. So the overall navigation is designed so that civil society organizations can jump in and out of the site to access information they find useful at any given time. And there are many possible pathways through the site that a CSO might choose. I'm going to introduce one pathway, assuming that we're a more established local organization working to prevent violent extremism, and we're mainly interested in learning more about monitoring and evaluating our work. Although we can jump right in to the M&E module here, just to be thorough, we'll check the Get Started page first. So let's say that this CSO is comfortable with its understanding of how violent extremism is defined, which is explained here in this box, and it's already established its programming to focus on PVE instead of CVE. And we explain that distinction here, as well as explaining the difference between countering terrorism and countering violent extremism, which is here. In this case, the CSO wants to understand how its M&E plan can integrate conflict sensitivity to mitigate any negative program impacts. We have an entire cross-cutting section dedicated to do no harm and conflict sensitivity that applies to each stage of the project cycle. And we'll come back to this at the end of my brief presentation. Okay, now that our civil society organization has this frame of reference, it wants to revisit its M&E framework since it has already conducted its assessments, done initial project design, and has begun project implementation. So it'll shift over to the monitor and evaluate module. For each module, we have the same general format. We start with objectives and guiding questions before getting into specific guidance, worksheets, and then resources at the end. In this case, our CSO wants to learn more about the best tools for data collection and verification in a PVE context, and it wants to manage data in a more conflict-sensitive manner. And these are among the objectives we address in this module. And since many CSOs struggle with monitoring and evaluation, a summary of the basic M&E concepts and components of an M&E plan are also presented here. Using this navigation tab at the bottom, we can find the next section, which covers the logical framework. And here we highlight the log frame, which is a key planning tool that provides a project roadmap so everyone involved can understand the project's goals and objectives. It describes project activities, goals, how progress will be measured, and risks and assumptions that could hinder progress. We emphasize how log frames and M&E plans need to be regularly reviewed and updated in a PCVE environment. Throughout the guide, we also offer worksheets. In this case, you can click on this 4-page worksheet to develop a project log frame. This basically walks you through that process. That's a brief look at it. We explain how to use the log frame, starting with the first column, which is a description of activities, outputs, outcomes, and goals. The next section deals with risks and assumptions. And even though risks include factors beyond the control of a project or the organization implementing it, planning for unexpected challenges is critical, especially for PCVE programs. Identifying these risks and assumptions in the log frame helps to determine whether redesigning aspects of the program is necessary. Indicators. Here, our civil society organization finds that indicators are defined as qualitative and quantitative measurements of a project's impact and processes. The drop-down box explains also why indicators should be used. The CSO can explore differences between qualitative and quantitative indicators, as well as the two main types of indicators: context monitoring indicators and performance monitoring indicators. And finally, the CSO can work through the indicator worksheet to customize its own set of indicators. Another key part of the log frame is the means of verification. In other words, the tools and procedures used to collect data to measure progress. Since our CSO is considering using both surveys and focus groups discussions to gather data, it finds this chart on the advantages and disadvantages of different data collection methods in a PCVE context to be very useful. I'll give you a second to look at that. Now, a lot of M&E, or some of the M&E information in this module isn't necessarily specific to PCVE, but here we make the connection between M&E and PCVE projects, as in other parts of the module as well. As I mentioned, our CSO is interested in the best data collection methods, as well as conflict-sensitive monitoring, which is explained in this section. the CSO not only wants to explore how to orient its indicators to account for changes in the conflict environment, it also wants to ensure that it's protecting the safety and security of its staff and participants when collecting data. For example, when consulting this chart on challenges in PCVE monitoring, our CSO is noting the steps outlined here to mitigate safety risks to staff. Not to skip over complexity-aware monitoring, it's also introduced here to help local organizations measure and respond to unanticipated changes in local context. CAM is particularly useful since PCVE environments have constantly shifting dynamics. On this page, the CSO can learn about formative and summative evaluations and how evaluation planning can be conducted through resources from CGCC and the Hedaya Center. A range of different evaluation methods are also presented. Part of the standard format for each module is the case study. In this case, we presented a case featuring the work of a Moroccan civil society partner organization named Shifa. They have undertaken a communications campaign to raise the awareness of youth about violent extremism in Tangier. The case study explains which methods were used to collect data on any changes in attitudes and behaviors of the youth audience. A summary of results and lessons learned is also offered as a very tangible example of how this plays out on the ground. The last section in each module focuses on the most relevant resources for that module. In this case, resources obviously are focused on M&E, but there is some overlap with the Learn module. Again, if you click on these resources, it will take you to the resource library where you can download the material. For example, our CSO can find one resource on conflict-sensitive approaches near the top of the list here. And it can download that particular resource here. But let's say that's not enough. Let's say our CSO would like more resources than those listed at the end of the module. You can use various buttons to navigate to the resource library, which has more than 300 guides, reports, toolkits, and web pages related to PCVE. The searchable index on the left has various filters related to geography, language of the resource, module type, resource type, and PCVE topic. In this case, our CSO would like to find more resources on conflict sensitivity, especially in relation to M&E. So typing conflict sensitivity into the search field pulls up this resource, which actually wasn't listed in the resource section of the module itself. So the CSO might find this particularly useful. Okay, and as you've seen, the M&E module has referred our civil society organization to the cross-cutting section on conflict sensitivity on several occasions. In this section, our CSO can learn more about how it can reduce any unintended consequences of its PVE programming through conflict-sensitive approaches. For example, by applying a do no harm approach and examining the dividers and connectors between groups, our local organization can determine which dividers to mitigate and which connectors to amplify to achieve better results. This dividers and connectors worksheet is a useful tool to get our CSO started. A conflict-sensitive approach is valuable during each phase of the project cycle. The CSO can use the Juno harm framework during the assess phase to identify connectors and dividers, during the design phase to identify possible negative impacts or possible entry points for project activities, and during the implementation to regularly assess and understand dividers and connectors and how they interact with this project. Finally, the CSO can apply the framework when monitoring, evaluating, and generating learning from its work to examine if the project is causing unintended negative impact. So each cross-cutting section also has relevant resources at the end for further guidance. I'm sorry I don't have time to review each of the 4 cross-cutting sections, but I encourage you to review the sections on youth involvement, gender equality and social inclusion, and stakeholder engagement when you get the chance. As I mentioned, this is just one pathway through the guide as determined by the specific needs of one sample CSO. I'd like to shift over to the discussion portion of the webinar. So let me try to toggle back to some sample questions just to see discussion. And I'll turn the moderation over to Lena. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Theo. That was really an excellent overview of a resource. You know, I want to tell our attendees that this works really well on your phone as well. And I'm sure you thought about that in terms of your target audience of local organizations working around the world. So it's so helpful with the phone as well. You know, we want to move to really hear what you're thinking as you see the presentation of this CVE reference guide. So we'd, you know, let me maybe offer one piece of feedback about what I feel about the reference guide, and that can spark, you know, some other answers that we'll hear from the rest of you. I mean, one of the things that I think is important, we're in 2020, and Theo, you referenced that there's 300 resources that you've selected to include very iteratively throughout the guide. And I'm sure you must have, you know, identified probably 5 or 6 times more different resources. And one of the things that's so helpful with this guide and the way you've designed it is that it really helps you to get what you want and to know how deep you want to go, and then to pull on other resources. Of course, these are resources not just from FHI 360, but from a range of organizations that have produced excellent tools over the years that really help people to get what they need. So that's really something that that I find very powerful in the guide. And you know, one question also for you, Theo, is just whether you feel as though there were certain things that needed, you know, updating now that we are in 2020. You know, perhaps aspects around how we understand the online ecosystem in terms of understanding and responding to violent extremist dynamics. So you can maybe hold on to that question, and let's see if there's some other responses to these questions here about your feelings on the reference guide. So please type your answers, and Jen, I'll let you facilitate this part here.
Sure, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer. I'm the communications lead at DME for Peace, and some of you have heard my voice before on Thursday talks. I would like to remind you all that you can send in your questions using the GoToWebinar dashboard in the question section. Write them out, and they will come to me. These can either be questions that you have for Theo, or at this time, responses you have to questions. We will get to both as time allows. And if you would like to ask the question using your own raise your digital hand also on the dashboard, and I will unmute you to either give your response to Theo, your question yourself. Otherwise, I will be your questions for you. And also, please, if you can, put your name and affiliation so I can attribute them. All right, so we have in already. I have a response from Edward Haglin, and my apologies to this pronunciation. I'm going to try my best, but I'm sure I will fall woefully short on some of your names, so my apologies. Edward asks, is your audience aware of the Department of State's Global Engagement Center's technology team and tools that relate to this area, which is at www.disinfo.com?
Should I take that question now, or should we collect questions, Jen?
I'm collecting questions right now. If you want to go ahead and answer this one, and then I will state the rest after if you have anything to say about this.
Sure. Thanks, Edward. So we're definitely aware of GEC's work, and we're happy to integrate additional tools into the reference guide site. So I can pass on, or Jen or Lena can pass on my contact information, and we'd be happy to consider how to integrate that into the site. As I mentioned, this is a living resource, so we'll continue to update it.
Wonderful, thank you. I also have, I have a response from Edward that says you did great. So that's great to hear. I am curious to ask, well, I'm just going to go through and read out what we have, because we have a few mixed in of responses and questions. So first, I have a question about the guide. Theo, how does the guide explore, advise working with security forces, police, law and order, and legal or human rights organizations? This is from Philip Visser.
Thanks, Philip. Appreciate you joining the webinar. That's a good question. I think, let's see. We'd have information for sure in the stakeholder engagement cross-cutting section. So I'd direct you first there. And that's the starting point. I'm just trying to think where else we would address that. Yeah, that's the primary avenue. But feel free to follow up. I know you have my contact information. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you about that. But I think the main section that cuts across all 5 of the project cycle modules would be in the stakeholder engagement cross-cutting section.
Great, thank you, Theo. I have from a Ted Perlmutter. It's in response to letting you know of additional resources. Ted makes the observation that I see no resources, even though I know that USAID has done a lot of work in the area. Ted is with Columbia University. Can you speak on that? If you have USAID resources or have looked into that?
Actually, we highlight quite a range of USAID resources, and there's my timesheet popping up. So I think they're interspersed throughout the modules, and I think there's a wide range of them, including in the resource library. So I'd encourage you to spend a little bit of time looking through each module, and they're very much focused. I mentioned, for example, in the M&E module, the complexity-aware monitoring. So we focus on that, which is featured in the USAID Learning Lab, just as one example.
Great, and Ted also has his hand raised, so I'm going to unmute Ted. And Ted, I saw that you had an additional question if you would like to ask. All right, Ted, you are unmuted.
Okay, So yeah, I mean, I've done a fair amount of work in sort of election violence monitoring, particularly in Kenya and places like that. And as I said, I mean, I know USAID has sort of been very deeply involved with that. And I was sort of looking across your cross-cutting issues and didn't quite see that, even though I know there's a sort of an enormous amount of resources to that. So I guess it's sort of a substantive question, and then just a question of division of labor, which is presumably somebody would want to find their way there unless you really just can see this as two completely different fields, which would not be my approach. I'm just sort of curious as to why this didn't get written in, and then how it might, people might have access to it if, you know, they're sort of in a difficult situation and they see an election coming forward.
Mm. Yes, thanks, Ted. Yes, so I think this as we culled the many resources that we were considering for the reference guide for inclusion, we tried to identify the most obvious cross-cutting areas, and certainly election violence could be one of them. I think there would be obvious overlaps in terms of the dynamics involved in election violence and how that potentially overlaps with PCVE. So that could be an additional cross-cutting section. We just weren't able to include it in this sort of in this current version of the site.
Great, thank you so much for that, Ted. So we also have more questions coming in. We have Casey Harrison from Nuru International with us today. Casey says, thank you for the walkthrough, Theo. Is there an output, in brackets, summary document or action plan that is generated once a CSO completes a module or so they can reference their work? Also, how did you consider recommendations for digital tool integration into modules? Remote data collection technology for M&E.
Okay, well, two great questions, Casey. Thank you. On the first point, I mean, I think for us, we just launched this initially in July. So yes, we absolutely want to know how the reference guide would be applied by local organizations, and we absolutely want to include local resources. I think those would be most useful for civil society organizations working in the PCEV space to learn from, not just those from international practitioners, although obviously those are also quite useful. So so I think we will have to figure out a plan for engaging, going back to many of the partners who we interviewed to understand how they're actually using the guide. And that's on our agenda, but we were just focused on getting this launched first. On your second question, Jen, can you repeat the second part of the question, please? On digital tools?
Sorry, yes, digital tools. Oh, I'm having a bit of an issue getting back to it. Casey, would you mind sending that second question back into us, or raising your hand? My apologies for it. I have lost it in the mix. So in my attempt to be as organized as possible, unfortunately. So please send that back into us, or feel free to raise your hand, ask yourself. And in the meantime,
digital. Yeah, it was about actually advice about using digital tools for data collection. And, you know, it links with what I was curious about earlier was, you know, given that we're in 2020, how much are we trying to offer guidance around understanding and assessing online things as well? And did you find that there was enough tools to reference there, you know, as you did in many of the other sections, Theo?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So, I mean, we do highlight certain data collection tools, especially if they're referenced through our survey respondents and interviewees. For example, we highlight Kobo Toolbox as a basic online digital data collection tool. But certainly there are many others, and that's a great idea actually for expanding the content in the guide, we can dedicate an entire section to digital data collection tools. I've made a note of that.
Wonderful, and thank you, Lena, for that prompt. We have an observation that has come in from Emanuela Rita Atson. Emanuela states, I think the CVE reference guide looks really, really great, but one thing caught my attention. When Theo was presenting the connectors and dividers tool, I saw that the dividers are negative and positive, and connectors are also negative and positive. All the while, I have not looked at it that way. I always thought dividers are negative while connectors are positive. I would like to better understand this. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a whole other discussion, but I think generally speaking, dividers are factors that cause distrust and divide groups, and connectors are more positive elements that build trust. However, that's not always the case. Dividers and connectors in certain situations can have opposite effects. So it's just important to recognize that. But I think that's included in a lot of the great materials provided by CDA and other organizations on conflict sensitivity and do no harm.
Wonderful, thank you. I also now have a question from Lindsay North, Center for Secure and Stable States at DA. Lindsay asks, are there plans to systematically collect feedback from CSOs/users of the guide longitudinally, to update or refine the guide, which Lindsay states is excellent, thank you. And then there's a second, yeah, sorry. Theo, that's for you.
Yes, thanks, Lindsay. We've got some M&E people on the webinar, not surprisingly. No, that's great. We're working on a plan. Obviously, we do want to know how this is applied, and we do plan to go back initially to a lot of the CSOs that we've worked with through our own projects as a small sample of organizations that would be applying the guide in our current and forthcoming projects. So that's still under development, but this was a 2-year process in building out this guide. So give us a little bit of time, please.
Lindsay says guilty as charged on the M&E.
Okay.
So now we have a question from Nalpes Tabiswa. Apologies again if I mispronounce some. The question is, isolating extremists from each side of the belligerents is one of the strategies I find necessary in the Eastern DRC conflict. Do you have ideas to share on that strategy?
Yes, I mean, if you'd like to contact me and share the strategy, I'd be happy to provide feedback. I think the purpose of this guide is for those questions to be asked by referencing a lot of the material in the guide, and then seeing if there are useful aspects of the guide that can address those questions. I can't answer that right now, but again, you're welcome to contact me separately, and I can have a look.
Wonderful. So our next question is from Ethan Walensky-Lanford. Ethan says, thank you for this wonderful and very useful work. As an evaluator with P/CVE interests and experience, I wonder if there are resources for CSOs to find support from external evaluators in terms of a registry or database that might be included. Ethan is with us from Terra Luna.
Yeah, that's a great question. It sounds like you're talking about some type of community of practice or network focused on M&E. I don't know the answer to that. Lena, do you have any input on that?
No, I'm sorry, I don't.
Okay. Yeah, I personally don't know the answer to that.
All right, well, thank you, Ethan. And if you would like to further explain or have an ongoing conversation, you can always contact Theo, and we are happy to pass along. We also have a comment section under the recording of. We can include a further back and forth on this once it is posted later this afternoon. We also have a question from Laura McGrew. Laura says, we used to be able to read all the questions, which I find helpful. Oh, excuse me, this is for us. Laura says that my voice, unfortunately, is going in and out, so are missing keywords in the questions. Apologies, Laura, for that. I'm not quite sure why that's happening. It might be because when audience members come and go from the webinar, unfortunately, currently it brings my voice in and out because I am the organizer, and that's how GoToWebinar is functioning. It didn't always work this way. This is a newer development that I also find very annoying, and it is something that I would personally like to contact GoToWebinar about. But to keep the conversation going, and my apologies for that, I am moving on to Khalid Salim. Khalid says, my quick feedback is that this is an excellent reference, structured and to the point. My question is there any software that supports the reference, with the reference guide, which might make it more user-friendly?
Well, that's a great idea for the further development of this. We could consider making it into some type of mobile app, for example, like the Masar app, which we reference in the guide. That's a great suggestion. But as you can imagine, building out this type of resource in Drupal is a challenge just by itself. So this is the starting point, but we would certainly consider making it into an app, funding permitting.
Great, thank you for that. I also have a response from Casey Harrison, who has now left us, that Casey said, thanks for the responses and all the great work to bring this together over the past 2 years. So that was very nice. Thank you, Casey.
Thanks.
I have Joyce Joseph Bowman from Nigeria. Joyce says, I love the program, but please, how can conflict sensitivity as it regards to religion be tackled? Thank you. So if either of you would like to jump in on that.
That's a big topic, and I do know that we have resources available on that issue in the resource library. And if you can't find any, we'll dig deeper into that and add them to the resource library. Lena, if you have anything to add on that, feel free.
No, I think an upcoming webinar will be about Search's guide on religious engagement. So stay tuned to this space for more information about that. But you know, Theo or at Search, there's definitely resources around that area of work, Joy.
We are getting towards the end, and I'll let Lena wrap it up for us. We have had. We do have one, and we can tackle this quickly, and we've kind of referenced it before with new technology and ways that we can share this. Nasir, many thanks for this initiative and content, an app that could work offline for remote areas.
Yeah, I mean that's a challenge. I mean this is a purely online tool, so it essentially wouldn't function without some kind of internet access. But again, looking at the previous question about possibly developing this as a mobile app, that would make it more accessible for someone who could potentially use it on a smartphone. So that's certainly something we'll look into.
Great, thank you. And I'll let Lena wrap things up since we're getting near the end of our time, but we do have more questions coming in. I want to let everyone know that you will be and Lena will go over this more later, but you will be receiving a quick survey after this because you've attended the webinar, and this won't sign you up to any email list or anything, but it's purely to let Theo know more of your thoughts and opinions. So if you haven't been able to ask your question or we haven't been able to get to it today, you will be able to let Theo know at that point in time. And Theo, I also have requests for your contact information if that is something that you would like to share. Multiple
Absolutely.
people who would like to make contact with you.
Absolutely, yes. So my email is tdolan, TDOLAN @FHI360.org.
And I've just added that to the chat box so everyone should be able to see it.
Great.
Fantastic. All right, Lena, if you'd like to lead us out. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Theo, and to all of you listening in. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. As Jen said, you'll be receiving a survey to give some more feedback around this tool. I encourage you to try and just look at it on your phone and see how well it works, not only on the computer, on the phone as well. And you know, this will be posted online on the M&E Thursday Talk discussion page later today. And so you can share that, and you can also add more questions and discussions in the comments section. So that's it for us today. We'll be back soon with a new M&E Thursday Talk with our digital peace building friends at Build Up. So keep an eye out on our website and social media platforms for the details and updates on this upcoming webinar. We're looking forward to talking with you again today, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.